least not yet. And my background is in social work. So what I do is every time that an inmate writes to us, I respond to them. And I decide if it's the type of case that we're able to take. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the history of our program, the mission of our program, and then I'm going to transition more into how big is a problem of people being wrongly convicted, and talk about a few case studies that we've worked on that kind of show the great things that Innocence projects can do, but also the consequences that can come from being incarcerated when you did not commit a crime. So our program was founded in 1998 by Professor Keith Finley and John Prey, and if you ever have a chance to see them speak, they are far more eloquent than me. But they both saw this need where they were working in the Frank J. Remington Center, which is a program at the law school which helps people who are wrongly incarcerated or who have maybe their sentence is way too long, maybe they're supposed to get visitation with their kids and they're not getting visitation with their kids. There's lots of programs within the Remington Center. But in 1998, when our program started, it was because Keith and John were seeing lots of people write to us who were saying they were innocent. And we didn't have a program specifically set up for that. We were focusing a lot more on getting people's sentences to a fair amount, instead of having them be for their whole life, maybe getting them 10 years off, that type of thing. We're also helping with re-entry, so making sure that people are actually getting parole when they were eligible. But we saw this need where there's lots of people writing to us who say they didn't do what they're in prison for. And that wasn't something that we had a specific program for. So we ended up being about the third program in the nation to help innocent people. I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of the Innocence Project in New York, and that's a program that helps people who are claiming innocence and where there's the potential to test DNA. So they've had a lot of success with that, but there's also many, many, many cases where DNA isn't available. And so we help with cases where there is DNA possible and also where there isn't DNA possible to be tested. And so our mission is to exonerate the innocent, educate students, and reform the criminal justice system by identifying and remedying the causes of wrongful convictions. So it's kind of a three-part goal, and we do that by having law students help on these cases. That helps educate them and help make more thoughtful attorneys in the future. Whether they go into criminal law or family law, they understand that there are issues in our criminal justice system. Since we were founded in 1998, we've helped release 22 wrongfully convicted people from prison, which is great, but we have many, many more. Right now we have 82 cases that are open. Students are investigating them. They're being helped by the attorneys. We have court orders in some of them to get DNA testing, so we have a lot going on right now. We have 18 law students and 4 supervising attorneys, so they all work really, really hard and have very large caseloads. But like I said, we have a big caseload. It doesn't really tell us how big the problem is, though, of people being wrongly convicted. So at this point, there have been 1,579 exonerations in the United States since 1989. So that's a lot. And that includes cases where there's DNA tested to prove their innocence and other forms of new evidence to show that they were innocent. Those numbers are collected by the National Registry of Exonerations. It's a really great resource because what they're doing is they're scouring all around the nation, asking anyone who may know information about if they know about any exonerations. And they're putting those together into a database so we can learn more about the causes of wrongful convictions and what we can do to prevent them. Very notably, there have been 18 exonerations from death row. Many of them quite close to when they were going to be executed. It's not my area of expertise because in Wisconsin we don't have the death penalty, but it's concerning, and it kind of shows that even in the cases where they have the most litigation and they have the most people working for the defense, there can still be these errors. And so there's been studies done. One study took all of the capital rape murder cases from one of the states in the South, and I'm sorry, I don't remember which one, and they tested all the evidence that hadn't been tested. And from those, they found that there was about 3% that were innocent. And so if we extrapolate from that, we figured that there's at least that many in other types of crimes, because in robberies, burglaries, other types of crimes where you maybe aren't getting life sentences or death sentences, much less evidence is collected, much less investigation is done, and you may not get an adequate attorney as well. So if the number were 3 to 5%, that would mean in the United States there's 60 to 100,000 innocent people in prison right now. So it's a big problem, and one thing that we are doing to help with it is we have one of the biggest programs in the nation, but that's still kind of not enough, because right now we have 276 cases waiting for students to be assigned to them to investigate. And we receive over 500 requests every year, so that's the part that's my job, is I go through those requests and see how many of them should go onto the wait list. And our students, every single student puts in well over 700 hours a year, but it's just not enough. There's so much work that needs to be done on individual cases, but then also to reform the system. And something to keep in mind, I know some people wonder, well, everyone thinks that they're innocent, and everyone's writing to you and saying they're innocent, but that's really not the case. In 2010, we got a very large grant from the federal government, and we sent out over 6,000 applications to Wisconsin inmates, saying that they could write to us and we would review their case. And it included an application. Of those, we only received 2,000 back. So the other 4,000 people didn't want to even let us know what they were thinking, if they were innocent or if they were guilty. Of those 2,000 applications we got back, 500 of them specifically checked, "No, I do not want your help." And many of them wrote notes saying, "I am guilty of what I did, so please use these resources to help someone else." So it's not everyone in the prison system who thinks they should get out. And for the most part, when we help clients, there's not a lot we can do, and it's sad because they are the ones who are they're innocent. Well, not most of them, but a lot of them really are innocent, and so it's sad when we run against barriers that make it so we can't help them. And so I'm just going to talk a bit about the general causes of wrongful convictions. I don't have enough time to get into all of them. We have a full year that we spend with our students, and we just graze the top of these with them. So I obviously don't have much time to talk about every single one of them. But as you can see, mistaken witness ID accounts for 34% of exonerations. Some exonerations have a couple of these going into them, but 34% of exonerations have a mistaken ID. One case that many of you have probably heard of, and maybe why you've heard of our project, is Stephen Avery. In his original case, where he was convicted of a sexual assault, an attempted murder, and false imprisonment, his conviction was based almost entirely on a eyewitness ID. In 2003, so after he had been incarcerated for 18 years, we completed DNA testing, which proved that a convicted sex offender who was in prison was the person who committed that sexual assault. The victim in that case is now a very strong advocate for eyewitness ID reform, but as many of you probably know, Stephen Avery did go on to commit another crime, a very tragic crime. It was a homicide, and we have not helped him since that time. One thing that does bring into question, though, is what did being in 18 years in prison do to him for something that he did not commit? And it's a very tragic story, but he was innocent of the first crime that put him in prison for 18 years. The second type that is shown here. Perjury or false accusation is in 55% of exonerations. And so this can either be snitch testimony, where someone in the jail thinks that they have information that could get them a deal. So they might make that up. They might look through someone's paperwork and read what the police think and go to the police and say, you get me a deal and I'll tell them that you did that he did it. But it can also be making a false accusation. So in a second here, I'll show you a clip of Devon Robinson, and this is a case where the victim accused Devon of something he did not do, and 4 years later came to police and said, I lied. Her mother pressured her to lie, and he was exonerated based on that. There's also 13% of cases involve false confessions. I'm going to talk a bit more about false confessions later, because our first exoneration, which was Christopher Ochoa, included a false confession. There's also a lot of cases are false or misleading evidence. So this was something I will also talk about a bit more later. It occurs in 23% of cases. One of our clients, Lee Stinson, was convicted almost entirely based on bite mark evidence. Many studies have shown that bite marks are not strong evidence against someone, and as you'll see in pictures that I have later in a video, his bite mark did not match, but there is always someone that may say that it will. Another case of that is Stephen Avery. In the first case, along with the eyewitness ID, there was microscopic hair analysis. Since this time, the FBI has officially debunked forensic hair analysis. They will not use it anymore, and they've had to review many, many cases where microscopic hair analysis was done. So, I mean, this is something where you take one of my hairs, and if you took one of my mom's hairs, maybe the difference would be that it was curly, and that would be it. But if you compared, if somehow you only got a little piece of my hair, you didn't get the whole thing, and then you compared it to a full piece of Brian's hair, it could be the same person, because we have very similar colored hair. If you just took part of mine, it would look very similar. So that's concerning, but luckily it's not being used very much anymore. And then another thing that's in almost half of the cases, 46%, included official misconduct. So this is either police or prosecutors or a judge, either hiding evidence, planting evidence, not sharing evidence. All of those would constitute official misconduct. Luckily, in Wisconsin, none of our exonerations have been based solely on officials doing something wrong, so I don't have a very good Wisconsin example of this. But if you're interested, there is a documentary on Netflix about Michael Morton, and he is a case where there was official misconduct. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is show you a video. It's very, very short. It's of Devon Robinson when he was released, and I spoke about him earlier when we talked about victims making a false accusation. So I'll get it started. Oh, this might be the one that doesn't. Did you get internet? No. No? Okay, sorry. No internet. So, what I will do, because it really is a moving video, is I'm going to probably email it to Liz or my parents. So if any of you are interested, you can see it later. It's really very, very moving. Okay. So next case I'm talking about is Chris Ochoa. He was our very first exoneration. He's from Texas, and this is a picture of him with his defense team. So on his left is Barry Scheck. He was one of the attorneys on O.J. Simpson's case, and he is the founder, one of the founders of the Innocence Project in New York. To the left of Barry Scheck is Keith Finley, who is one of our founders, and behind Chris is John Prey, one of our other founders, and then the other two younger people are students who are on his case. And so I'm going to show you a video where the attorneys who are on the case and Chris speak about this because they are much better at explaining what happened in his case than I am.
It is the kind of nightmare that reads, at first glance, like the script of a bad movie. Under pressure to solve a sensational murder, a tough cop threatens a suspect with the death penalty and the likelihood of jailhouse rape if he doesn't cooperate. The suspect confesses and also implicates a second person. They are sentenced to life in prison. One day, the real killer, serving time for another crime, gets religion, confesses to the murder, and DNA tests confirm his guilt. A real nightmare. Tomorrow in Austin, Texas, Christopher Ochoa is expected to walk out of jail after spending more than 12 years behind bars.
He was also a young and naive person who had never had a brush with the law, and when he got into that interrogation, he became convinced that whether he did this crime or not, he was going to be executed.
Jubilation filled the courtroom after a Texas judge frees an innocent man. Thanks to the efforts from 2 Wisconsin law professors and their students, 33-year-old Christopher Ochoa was released from prison today.
And I'm very glad for the lawyers that helped him out. And I don't know how I could pay back all this they're doing for my son.
Well, Dora Ochoa, congratulations to you, and John Prey to you as well.
John, can you estimate how many cases like Chris there may be?
Boy, it's impossible. You know they're out there. There are people in prison, and we were lucky in this case that the DNA evidence was preserved, because in too many cases it's simply trashed or thrown away. And so there's a lot of people out there like Chris, but unfortunately only a fraction are going to be able to enjoy the kind of day that he is having today. After Chris got out, we stayed in contact with him, and he had expressed an interest to finish his education, which he did. He then, of course, wanted to come to the University of Wisconsin Law School, which we encouraged him to apply, and he did get in. He came to the school. He ended up being one of our students at the Innocence Project. He then graduated and is now an attorney in Madison, Wisconsin.
The letters come from all over the United States. The majority probably come from...
So, Chris is one of our happy endings, you may say, but he still struggles with what happened to him every day. Just last week he was presenting in front of the legislature and got very choked up, talking about the nightmares that he still has. He's very quiet, soft-spoken, extremely kind, and that's something that we've been able to benefit from with the Wisconsin Innocence Project, having him around to remind us that even if afterwards people move on and they get a job and have a family, this is something that scars them for life. He's very successful, obviously, but it still makes a giant impact. So up here we have the letter that Chris wrote to us asking for help. And so it says, "The reason I am writing to you is that I am in a Texas prison doing a life sentence for a murder I did not commit." Later it says, "You're my last hope. All I want is someone to believe me. My record in prison, the lack of criminal record prior to my arrest, and the many discrepancies in my conviction show that I'm an innocent man. A lot of us innocent people had about given up on the justice system. So you see, I haven't given up on myself. I just about have given up on the justice system. You're my only hope." And so those are letters that we get every day. His, I would say, is maybe more eloquent than some, but the message is still there. Those are the letters that I read every day, and it's hard because we can't help everyone. We want to help everyone, and we can't. But luckily, I guess for Chris, we were there and we were able to help him. So this next slide, this is a picture, many pictures, of the confession that Chris signed. 5 pages, and it was written by the police who interrogated him with facts that they supplied to him. They would ask him a question about what happened. He would give an answer that was not what they thought happened, and they would correct him and have it change so it's what they thought happened in the crime. So he signed this, and he then also testified against his co-defendant. So when he was released, his co-defendant was also released, and it's obviously a very happy story. The other thing to keep in mind with this is that Chris is very lucky because he was exonerated from Texas. Which I know a lot of people are probably like, really, you're lucky, you're from Texas? But in Texas, you get much more compensation for being wrongfully convicted than you do in Wisconsin. And I'll talk more about the Wisconsin compensation law in just a second. But he was entitled to $80,000 for every year he was incarcerated. And he also received assistance to attend school. So obviously in no way this makes up for him having been imprisoned for all this time, taking all these years away from him, but it does allow him to have the freedom right now to, when he's having a rough year and can't be practicing law, he's able to rely on that assistance. That is something that people who are released from Wisconsin do not have. So cases like Chris's are not uncommon. People falsely confess in 13% of cases that led to exoneration. So why do you guys think someone might falsely confess to a crime?
They're trying to protect someone else.
Protect? Here's someone.
People.
Yeah. Another reason is that police will often say, look, I know you're a good guy, just cooperate with me. You sign this and you can go home, but you can't go home.
So they lie to them?
Yes, police can lie to them. The good thing is, there's good news. After learning about many cases like Chris's, we worked with the legislature and the Wisconsin Attorney General to put reforms in place for interrogations. And those included that they're required to record all interrogations. So that is very helpful. Obviously, it didn't help everyone right now who's in prison, but it's something that moving forward hopefully will mean that there's fewer wrongful convictions. Okay, so the next case that I'm going to talk about is Joseph Fry. And he was released in 2013. He was originally convicted of sexual assault. It was a sexual assault that occurred near the Oshkosh campus. A young woman, a stranger comes in and rapes her. He was living up in Green Bay at the time, and a police officer who knew that he had previously committed much less violent sexual assaults, like fourth degree, third degree sexual assaults, wrote to the Oshkosh Police Department and said, you should look at this guy, I think he did it. And then that created a tunnel. That's all that the Oshkosh police really looked into. At the time he was convicted, there was very early DNA testing that was done, and it excluded Joe. He was still convicted. When we took on his case in 2012, our students went and asked the clerk of court to physically go look for this evidence, because they said it had been destroyed. The clerk found one piece of sheet that was cut where they said that there was a semen stain, and that was tested, and it matched a convicted sex offender who was not our client, Joe. He had passed away before that time, but in speaking to his family members and the roommates at the time, this woman, we determined that Joe could not have been the person who sexually assaulted the victim, and James Crawford would have been the person, because on his deathbed he told his brother that he committed a sexual assault that he was never caught for. Before that, though, before he died, but after Joe was convicted, James Crawford committed 2 sexual assaults on young girls. So this is one of those consequences where when we get it wrong, when we put the wrong person in prison, that means the right person is still out there and can still commit crimes. So even if maybe you think Joe is a bad man because he did commit other sexual assaults, maybe that's fair, but James Crawford was a bad man who got to keep doing things to children. So that's just the type of thing where we do get some resistance, you know. We do help people who maybe don't have perfect records, but just because they don't have a perfect record doesn't mean that the actual person who committed a crime should be able to walk around and continue to commit crimes. And I said that I would talk about the Wisconsin compensation laws. So when Joe was released, right now he's hugging his sister in this picture. She doesn't really have much of anything to her name and lives in a different state. She came up for this, but she's not in the position to help Joe by any means. Joe came out, he decided he wanted to live in Madison. He didn't have any money. He did not have any services provided to him. He had many medical conditions. As you can see, he's using a cane. He was released with 3 days of medications, no health care, and said, good luck, basically. Like, we're happy for you. Okay, go ahead and get out. He didn't have any clothes. We bought him those clothes. So I spent the next summer with him. He said we paid for one night in a hotel with him, but it's not something we can afford to just put him up in a hotel until we figure it out. So after that one night, he went into the Dane County homeless shelters. He stayed there for about a month before a local area nonprofit called Porchlight offered. He was on their wait list. Their wait list is about 3 months long to get a room. Actually, it's longer than that. But they called and offered him a place after hearing about his story. So he's been very fortunate in the community kind of helping him. He now has a part-time job working at a bakery, and he's going to school. But there was a few months there where we really didn't know what was going to happen because we had to fight to get him Medicaid. We had to fight to get him food share because he didn't have a work record. He worked in prison, but that doesn't count. So he's doing much better now, but he still struggles because when he was released, afterwards we filed for compensation for him. The current law says that exonerees can get $5,000 a year per year that they were confined, with a maximum amount of $25,000 a year. So you can get compensation for 5 years and only at the rate of $5,000. In comparison, the federal government's rate is $50,000 a year with no maximum. So I kind of explained what that meant for Wisconsin exonerees. We're very lucky. Most of our exonerees have supportive families, supportive friends. They come out and they have somewhere to go. They have people who can support them. But Joe didn't have that, and we really saw how detrimental it could be to not have that. And what's interesting is that this is such a bipartisan issue. This is just last week. Representative Koyunga, I'm probably saying that wrong, is a Republican, and down on the right is Representative Gary Hebel. And they are working right now to present a bill that would change the compensation to $50,000 a year with no maximum amount. It would also provide some social services. So, as you may know, when someone is released on parole or extended supervision, they do receive a parole agent, they receive services, they receive some help. When someone is exonerated, at this point, they don't get any of that. It's just, congratulations, you're on your way. So we're very, very happy to have bipartisan support of this year. We're hoping it gets through, so that's good news. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about Robert Lee Stinson. And this is a story of very flawed forensic sciences. A homicide happened in a Milwaukee neighborhood. Lee lived next door to the victim. He was very young, had no record, but the victim had bite marks on her skin. So a forensic odontologist, which is just like a fancy dentist, made a sketch of what he thought the bite marks what the person's teeth would look like. And the police went around the neighborhood, showed it to people, asked people if they thought they knew anyone who had that type of bite. And a couple of people said, well, that might be Lee, because he was missing a front tooth. And I'll show you later why him missing a front tooth was probably the biggest reason that he did not commit the crime. But they had two experts presented at trial who said this has to be Lee's bite mark. And defense called one expert who said it probably is. That's probably right. And so I'm going to show you a video now about Lee's release. It also has a couple images of the bite marks, so I don't find them graphic, but they are bite marks on skin, so just as warning. Huh. So this is, oh, the reason the volume is not working, Dad? Okay, I'll keep talking about Lee's case for a couple of seconds. Hopefully we can get it figured out. So he was released in 2008. In 2010, we requested further DNA testing in his case to try and find the actual perpetrator. That was completed and matched Moses Price, who was a convicted sex offender. He confessed to the crime and was convicted. And it's interesting because and very important because in 44% of DNA exonerations, they were able to identify the person who actually committed the crime. So it really serves two purposes. It gets someone who did not commit the crime out of prison, and it gets the right person consequences. Is that not going to work, Dad?
I think it's something to do with that player.
It's the same player I used before. Okay. Well, in that video, it showed the bite marks, and I'll kind of give you the punchline, is that Lee was missing a tooth right here. In the bite mark on the arm, there was the largest indent was where he is missing a tooth. But that evidence wasn't enough to get him exonerated. We had to go back and do DNA testing and exclude him. And that happened, and then obviously later it matched Moses Price, which is great. So that's kind of the postscript to that a little bit. Lee is a great guy. He, after he got out, he helped his mom, who was very ill. She recently passed away. He's looking for a job as a caretaker. It can be hard because in Wisconsin, although the cases show up on circuit court access, it is being dismissed. So it says, you're not charged for this anymore. It still shows up, and it can be extremely hard to overcome having a homicide on your record, even if it says it was dismissed. We also have several cases where not only does the case show up, the prosecutors offer a plea deal that's pretty much too good to give up, because a lot of times people are, once someone's case is overturned, they still face retrial. And they've gone to trial before and been convicted on not much evidence. So they face this again. When a prosecutor offers you a deal that says, you don't need to go back, you can stay out of prison, it is extremely difficult to say, no, I'm going to go to trial and risk another jury convicting me. So we have at this point 3 cases where people have decided to take that plea deal so that they can stay out of prison. But then that means that there's something on their record. They pled to something. In one case, there was DNA evidence that was quite strong, circumstantial evidence that was quite strong showing his innocence, and alibi testimony showing his innocence. He lives in Milwaukee. He could not face another jury trial because in his neighborhood, everyone who went to trial went to prison. So the fact he could be out and just on probation for a little bit and have this on his record, that was good for him. He gets to be with his mom. But it's nearly impossible to get a job when you have a reckless homicide on your background checks. So that's it. But going back to Lee, he had some good news happen. When someone files for compensation, if the claims board grants it, they can also recommend that a bill be passed offering them more compensation. And so in 2014, that's what happened. A bill was passed that provided Lee with $90,000 of compensation. But again, compared to the federal standard, that's really doesn't make up in any way for the amount of time he spent in prison. But this is him with Scott Walker signing that bill that allowed Lee to get $90,000. Two of our attorneys are there, and then this attorneys who represent him civilly are also there. So that is very good news. I'm gonna, Shante Odd is another person who we helped. He was convicted mostly based on snitch testimony. So the co-defendant implicated him in return for a plea deal, which is obviously something that happens and we hope would happen less. He was also exonerated. That's a picture of him with his defense team. When he got out, he just wanted to go to like a neighborhood restaurant from where he grew up. This is another case where we identified the actual perpetrator. This is Walter Ellis, who is now known as the Northside Strangler for the number of homicides that he committed in Milwaukee. And so that's good. He got, we figured out who it was. That's great. And just last week, it was announced that the city of Milwaukee, because of their misconduct in the investigation, would pay Shante $6.5 million. So again, that sounds like a lot, but speaking to him, knowing him, it's not going to make life that much better. He's been working, he's been doing well, but having to sit in prison for something you did not do scars you for life in a way I don't think any of us will ever understand. So that's the end of my presentation. Do people have questions?